All right, I think we are just about ready to begin. I'm going to double check to see if Paul and Alan are at the ready here. Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Okay, why don't we go ahead? Let me get something set up here. Here we go. All right, if you are ready, Paul, then I think we are ready to begin. And is Alan going to be just joining as need be, or will he also be presenting?
I'm going to start, Susan. This is Alan.
Oh, hello, Alan. Okay, that sounds great. So again, this is Alan Shepard and Paul Griffith, both with the BLM, and we really appreciate you being here and presenting on Wild Horse and Burro program. So I will turn it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Alan Shepard. I'm the on-range branch chief for the National Wild Horse and Burro program for the BLM. First of all, I thank the organizers for inviting Dr. Griffin and I to present some information about the horse program and the subject of sagebrush restoration and conservation. Susan, next slide, please. During the talk with us this afternoon, we want to talk a little bit about the Wild Horse program and our management, and it's part of BLM's multiple use mandate of the public lands. We'll talk a little bit about the potential and very possible effects of overpopulations of wild horses and burros on rangeland habitats. Talk a little bit about the fact that most areas with wild horses and burros are pretty low in resilience and resistance. So that needs to definitely be taken into account as we move forward with efforts in conservation or restoration. And habitat restoration needs to be taken into account. Wild horses and burros need to be taken into account in these activities because their overpopulations can and will have an impact on that potential restoration. Next slide, please. As most of you know, the Wild Horse and Burro Act was passed in 1971. It identified that management of wild horses and burros would be administered by the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture. So that covers the BLM and Forest Service lands. It also identifies that wild horses and burros would not be managed outside of those areas identified in the 1971 Act. So we're restricted to our management in those areas. And the ultimate goal of the Act was to maintain a thriving naturally ecological balance in support of multiple uses of the public lands. Next slide, please. To give you a quick overview of the BLM's program, these numbers do not take into account the Forest Service lands that are managed either separately or jointly with our BLM areas. BLM has currently 177 herd management areas identified. These were established through the public land use planning process, so there was public involvement there. It covers roughly 26.9 million acres of lands in 10 Western states. Our current identified appropriate management level is 26,690 spread through those 77 HMAs. Our March 2019 estimated population was just over 88,000 animals. That number, we're currently accumulating our end of the year stats, is what we call them, right now, and we'll be releasing those numbers in the near future. And we can definitely anticipate those numbers to be much higher for March of 2020. Right now, we have over 49,000 animals over appropriate management level. And then, or I should say, excuse me, my numbers are messed up here. And we have roughly 111,000 excess animals, including our off-range facilities. The bulk of our off-range facilities are in the Midwest, where they're on large pastures that we contract with private property owners. These numbers, as I said earlier, do not include the Forest Service numbers. You can see some of the Forest Service areas. Most of the Forest Service areas are in central and parts of Nevada, but it also doesn't take into account the feral horse populations in several Western states, on Native American reservations, stray animals that have been scattered out on state and public lands, and as well as other feral populations that are in existence. Next slide, please. Our appropriate management level was based on to support the long-term sustainability of wild horse and burro populations across the West. These were established through a public process based on resource monitoring of the resource that's available in each and every HMA to determine, that those areas had the sustainable resources on an annual basis for those populations. We look at forage cover, we look at water availability, areas that the animals can use, and make a judgment call through that analysis on what's the appropriate number of animals, which is the AML. Most of our AMLs are established in a range with a high and a low. The high number is what we call the appropriate management level. The low number is what we target to, when we do population management, we gather down to that number and let it increase over time. And the key thing again is to look at a balance and balance that with the other multiple use relationships that we have with wildlife, agriculture, recreation, other activities on the public lands. Next slide, please. One of the key things with populations, as everybody knows, they keep growing. Our horses and burros grow somewhere between 15 and 20% per year, depending on the species on average. So they're gonna grow, they're gonna continue to grow as long as they have space and forage and water to keep them growing. Our gather activities or our population activities, control activities, currently are very dependent on available space to hold animals once we remove them, as well as the long-term maintenance of those animals once we remove those from the public lands. And the other key aspect of that is to have the available funding. Some years we have the space, no funding. Some years we have the funding, no space. It's not very likely in every given year that we have both. So we have to do a lot of juggling. In 2019, BLM was fortunate enough to have the funding and space to remove over 7,300 wild horses and burros across the West. But the key thing is we still grew. When our stats are accumulated here soon, I estimate that we'll be in the vicinity of 95 to 96,000 wild horses and burros on the public lands. So we still are showing gains, even though we're making decent strides in removals of those population levels. So right now we're basically removing about half of what our annual increases are, based on having 88,000 plus animals on the public lands. Fertility control is one of our tools that we use. We use multiple tools for our population management. A key thing with fertility control it's much less effective on overpopulated herds than it is on herds that are closer to appropriate management level. Fertility control alone will not reduce population sizes. It only controls their growth rates. So the use of fertility control isn't going to shrink your population, except if you can do it annually and for extended periods of times where other management avenues help decrease that size of the population itself. And over the years and into the future, we will continue to support looking for longer lasting fertility control research opportunities to give us more and more efficient tools to use in management of wild horses and burros into the future. So we continue to look for those tools. We work with academia and the private sector as much as we can in trying to find those tools. So we definitely will be spending additional funding that we have in the search of longer lasting fertility control options to help us with our management of overpopulations. And with that, I believe I turn it over to Dr. Griffin.
Thanks, Alan. Well, over the next few minutes, we'll spend a little time reviewing some ecological impacts that can result from too many horses on the range. This review is also covered in the Science Framework Report, Part 2. As we mentioned, appropriate management levels are set at herd sizes that allow for land health standards to be met. So if herds are kept at AML, then there will be some ecological impacts from horses, but they're going to be more localized and temporary. Whereas now most analyses of horse ecological effects that we'll discuss really only contrasted areas with horses compared to without horses. Fewer studies have included horse density as a continuous covariate. But it is mainly when horse herds are overabundant compared to AML that horses can cause severe and long-lasting changes in rangeland ecosystems. And these ecological impacts are the reason why restoration projects need to have clear plans to keep nearby wild horse herds at AML. The reality right now is that most managed herds are 2 or more times greater than appropriate management level. So wild horse management has to be part of planning for any habitat restoration and conservation, including in sage-grouse habitat. Can we have the next slide, please? Horses can digest large volumes of low quality forage, so they can persist longer than native wildlife, even as resources get more and more depleted. Horse presence is generally associated with higher abundance and cover of grazing tolerant, unpalatable, and invasive plant species, including cheatgrass. At the same time, horses are associated with lower overall biomass of plant cover, lower native plant cover, lower shrub cover, lower overall plant biomass, and lower species richness. They can spread exotic invasive plant species like cheatgrass, which can sprout readily from their feces. And even though horses are mainly considered to be grazers, sagebrush itself can also be affected because shrubs can be a big part of horse diet, especially in summer in the Great Basin. Next slide, please. Horses can have especially severe impacts on aquatic ecosystems, riparian communities, and wet meadows. As with all the potential impacts that we are going to review, the question is always, how many horses are there relative to the resources? Horses do drink a lot of water, averaging more than 7 gallons per day, and they routinely commute long distances between water sources and forage. 10 miles or more a day has been recorded. So the closer the distance is to water that a horse has used, the more grazing pressure would be expected on an area like a restoration project. There are ongoing studies in Northeast California showing that wild horse impacts in wet meadows can also directly reduce sage-grouse nestling survival. Bottom line is, if you're planning a restoration project in an area with any wild horses nearby, you do need to keep a few things in mind. Projects less than 5 unfenced miles from a water source used by horses, wild horses, are subject to horse use. And restoration projects need a clear plan with long-term funding to keep those nearby wild horse herds at the appropriate management levels. Even if you're at AML, those projects are still going to be attractive to horses, and you may need to consider some form of temporary fencing at the site. If you fence a water source, though, you're going to have to allow for access, so for horses to have access to water, such as by piping it to a trough outside the fence. Next slide, please. Wild horses have been shown to displace native ungulates at water sources, and this can be especially problematic during droughts. The lesson here is that wild horse numbers, again, they have to be kept at levels that allow for other values such as native wildlife and hunting. And as with the other impacts we talk about, it's a question of how many wild horses there are relative to the resources and the appropriate management level. Next slide, please. Wild horses can limit reseeding project success. Here's an example. After a summer wildfire, this area in Oregon's Kiger herd management area was drill seeded in December 2011 with crested wheatgrass and native perennial grasses. And most of the horses had actually been removed ahead of time during a fall gather that brought the herd down to appropriate management levels. But other horses did migrate back in the spring. And then they concentrated their use in that seeded area. They plucked seedlings, they trampled extensively, and they prevented seed head production in the grasses. They also pulled up plastic cages around bitterbrush seedlings that had been planted in April 2012 in the same area. And all these impacts, they happen with horses still at quite low densities. So again, restoration projects need to keep wild horse herds in mind. If the project is less than 5 unfenced miles from any water source used by horses, they're definitely going to be subject to use and need to keep that in mind. And have a clear plan with dedicated long-term funding to keep those horse herds at AML. And even at AML, like this project shows, restoration projects like this are going to be attractive to horses. Next slide, please. There can also be other measurable differences between areas with versus without wild horses. Soil compaction and erosion were worse in areas with horses. Some studies, but not all, have found that invertebrates, small mammals, and reptile communities were less diverse. And all these results suggest that horse presence has broader effects on ecosystem functioning. Next slide, please. Yeah, there are even areas where the number of horses depletes resources so much that the horses themselves can starve or die of thirst. And BLM does have to respond to this kind of emergency as we're able to. But unfortunately, this type of situation may become more and more common as herd sizes continue to grow, especially during drought years. Next slide, please. Well, when you're planning, anybody looking at maps and boundaries of herd management areas or wild horse territories has to know that wild horses can go well beyond those boundaries. For example, here's some dots showing waypoints for observed wild horse groups in one aerial survey in Northern California. The green lines show the boundaries of the Forest Service territory, but you can see that horses ranged far outside those designated areas. So again, for restoration site planning and placement, even if the project area is beyond the herd management area boundaries, managers should still carefully consider the size, location, and potential growth of any nearby wild horses. Next slide, please. Yeah, now let's look at horse densities and landscape resistance and resilience. These maps are in the Science Framework Part 2 report by Michelle Christ and others. and they're available on the USGS science-based website. This map shows the March 2017 herd sizes in HMAs as being within AML, which is shown in blue, between 100% and 200% of AML, shown in yellow, or more than 200% of the AML, the appropriate management level, shown in red. And you can see that actually relatively few HMAs have herd sizes that are at appropriate management level, which is in blue. There are also some areas here shown in gray. Those are BLM administrative units that shouldn't have any horses at all, but the ones in gray do have anywhere from dozens to thousands of wild horses. Next slide, please. The science framework report highlighted that the sagebrush biome can be described in terms of resilience and resistance categories determined by soil temperature and moisture regimes, where low resilience and resistance implies an area that does not handle disturbances well and is easily invaded by exotic plants. So we can look at those categories in HMAs and territories that have horses. In this slide, the blue colors show HMAs with the highest resilience and resistance levels, with deeper shading showing higher horse densities relative to AML. Most of the areas with wild horses, though, have medium resistance and resilience in yellow, or even more so, low resilience and resistance shown in red. Nevada, in particular, has a lot of area with low resilience and resistance levels, but very high horse densities. Those are shown in the darkest red color. So if you did a restoration project in these areas, you could expect that the plants would not necessarily do well to begin with, just due to the soil moisture regime. And then you add to that a high number of horses and the project could be doomed. So in contrast, Wyoming has a pretty big swath of moderate resilience and resistance, where you might expect restoration projects to take pretty well, but most of those areas also have high horse densities, twice or more of AML. And so conservation and restoration in those areas could succeed if the managers there can limit the horse herd sizes for the long term. There's also a similar set of maps that's available to look at horse densities and sage grouse habitat quality, but we won't go into that today. But the bottom line again is that for conservation and restoration projects to succeed, wild horse densities compared to appropriate management level have to be part of long-term considerations. Next slide, please.
Okay, I think the take-home message here for everyone is wild horse management across the West is part of BLM's mandate. It is a legal mandate, and it's part of one of our values in the use of designated public lands. So we have to take their management into account. A key thing is wild horses, as Paul described, do not understand administrative boundaries. So if there's horses nearby and they need to go somewhere and you're producing a restoration project that's going to be a valuable food source, be prepared, they will likely find it. So you're going to want to understand that if they're in the vicinity, be ready for them to come visit. And as we've told everybody, wild horses and their potential impacts are here to stay and not going to go away very soon. So with that, if there's any questions, Paul and I can try to answer some if there's any time left.
Thank you both. Really appreciate that, Paul and Alan. And we actually do have a question and can probably have time for another question if someone asks it, but here's the question submitted. What is the status of the BLM's report to Congress about the horses?
The report to Congress is still in review by upper management. We anticipate it to go soon. I don't have a firm date on that, but it's definitely in review by headquarters. And once they feel that it's ready to go, it'll be sent forward. But we're hoping that it will go soon.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Are there any other questions for either Paul or Alan? I'm looking for any raised hands or any other submissions before we move on to land uses. All right, then we will go ahead and move on to the next presentation. Again, Paul and Alan, thank you very much for sharing that information with us today.
Thank you, everybody.